Hello, AP US History students. I wanted to go over with you the thematic review for Units 4 and 5 about migration. And I'm going to be doing that by looking at this Google Slides that I made, but I also want to refer you to the timeline that you can find on Google Classroom based on the theme of migration for Units 4 and 5. Let's go ahead and get started with this particular Google slide here. So the first thing I want to point out is Unit 4 is from 1800 to 1848. This is really a time period where we see a large expanse of the United States, and migration is going to help fill that time period. Unit 5 is from roughly 1850 to the end of Reconstruction, which ends in 1877. So that's the main thing that's happening during that time period. We're also seeing migration and the impacts of migration during that time period as well. So let's talk about one of the driving forces behind migration during especially Unit 4, which would be the impact of Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny is kind of a major theme with this time period and specifically migration. But a large part of Manifest Destiny is actually supported by the US government in this time period in the first half of the 19th century. One of the ways that it's promoted by the US government is just through the acquisition of land. So the most famous example of that would be in 1803 when we have the Louisiana Purchase. We also see that same government, when Thomas Jefferson is president, supporting Lewis and Clark's expedition to go out and explore the new territory and make it all the way to the Pacific and come back and report on what is in the interior of the United States all the way to the Pacific. Another major political government action that leads to more acquisition of land and therefore leads to more internal migration would be the actions of John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State. While he's Secretary of State, we get Florida, and he signs off on a couple of treaties that help to establish a boundary between the United States and Canada. John Quincy Adams is also the author of the Monroe Doctrine, which really firmly establishes that we will stay out of European affairs and we're going to protect the ideals of democracy in the Americas. That also tends to promote the idea of migration from other places in the Americas, potentially to the United States. Let's talk about these acquisitions that are happening in Unit 4. So this white area here on the map is Louisiana Purchase. We buy that from France in 1803. Another thing that John Quincy Adams specifically did in this Unit 4 time period is we have this British cession given to us in 1818. The Convention of 1818 does that. And also we have the Rush-Bagot Treaty, which establishes a boundary here, this tradition of a boundary between Canada and the United States, going from the Great Lakes further westward toward the Oregon Territory, and helps us, as well as Great Britain, get control of this Oregon Territory, which is this yellow territory up here. It's going to be divided, and then by 1846, we will have another treaty with Great Britain that's going to divide this territory. That's when Polk is president, along the 54th parallel line, and that's going to create this line of demarcation between Canada and the United States. So all of this acquisition of land, and by the way, here's Florida. Down here, we get Florida in 1819. So all of that acquisition of land is promoting the growth of internal migration and Manifest Destiny as we are expanding ourselves and expanding our role of our government across the United States. Transportation also plays a large role in migration in the United States in this Unit 4 and Unit 5 time period, specifically talking about canals and turnpikes and railroads. So canals and turnpikes are roughly happening around the same time. They're the beginning parts of Unit 4, so the first half really of the 19th century. Canals are largely funded by private investors and or sometimes by local governments. The Erie Canal is the best example of that. It's the most profitable example. I have a map here of where the Erie Canal goes. New York City's down here. You've got the Hudson River that you can travel on up to Albany, New York, where the Erie Canal roughly starts, and it goes westward all the way to Buffalo. So it's connecting the Atlantic Ocean here in New York all the way over to the canals, and it's going to really make that internal transportation across the Appalachian Mountain region a lot cheaper and a lot faster. That's paid for largely by private investors and some from New York itself. Another example of government action in trying to promote connection between different regions of the United States and migration is going to be the National Road. The National Road is started in 1811 and is completed in 1834. It's starting in Baltimore and is going westward all the way through Illinois. That's the historic National Road right there. So again, examples of roads and canals, that's going to increase migration, and it's also going to connect the west of the United States with the eastern part of the United States. Railroads are also starting to be built, in this particular time period, mostly in the Northeast. There's some in the Southeast, and then we're starting to see spreading westward. This gets really into Unit 5 when the Transcontinental Railroad is going to be built between 1863 and 1869. And that Transcontinental Railroad is a result of the Pacific Railway Act, which the Republicans passed right in the heart of the Civil War in 1863. So this map, railroads, the one on top, railroads built by 1870, this really shows you how much railroads really connected major parts throughout the northern half of the eastern quadrant of the United States, and how we do have railroads in the south. They're just not as heavily populated as it is in the north. And then you see that 1869 connection of the Transcontinental Railroad. This is the first Transcontinental Railroad completed in Promontory Point, Utah, in 1869. And then we're going to see by 1890, just 20 years later, how much railroads continue to grow both in the South, but then also spreading westward across the United States. So those railroads are going to facilitate migration. They're also going to facilitate the transport of goods and the idea of a national market. Another thing that's impacting migration during this time period is going to be immigration from Europe. We see mostly immigrants coming from Ireland and Germany, and anywhere from the 1820s to the 1840s, we have anywhere between 10,000 to 100,000 immigrants coming in. And then by 1845, with the potato famine happening in Ireland, the floodgates are going to open, and we're having a much larger amount of immigrants coming in. Again, mainly from Ireland during that time period. One impact of that is going to be the growth of nativism in the United States, and the Know Nothing Party really gaining popularity in the 1850s is going to be the best example of nativism as a reaction to this migration to the United States. Going back to the idea of manifest destiny, I talked about the Louisiana Purchase. The War of 1812, in part, was fought to grow the United States and spread the United States. The role of cotton and people moving westward to try to make their wealth off of growing cotton is going to really also drive manifest destiny and internal migration, especially into the southwestern part of the United States. We have things like Alabama fever pushing for that. And with cotton, we see the expansion of slavery and forced migration. So we have internal migration that's not forced, and forced migration with the spread of slavery into those regions. Texas is going to be part of that role of expansion of cotton and slavery when first Texas is going to get its independence in 1836, and the annexation of it's going to be 1845. The gold rush is also driving internal migration between 1848 and 1850. This helps lead to the Compromise of 1850, so there's a connection here between migration and politics. We also see trails happening across the United States to push people westward and allowing them that opportunity before the Transcontinental Railroad, the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail being two major examples of that westward migration before the Transcontinental Railroad is completed. And this is a map that specifically shows you some of those trails before the Transcontinental Railroad. This green line here is the Oregon Trail, and we have the Mormon Trail of people heading over to Salt Lake City via these routes drawn in right here. Specifically talking about Texas, people started migrating into what was then Mexico in the 1820s and in the 1830s. They brought slaves with them. They were there to grow cotton. that conflict between Mexico's government and those Americans moving into Texas will lead ultimately to the Texas independence movement. Texas will gain its independence in 1836 and be independent until 1845. Then the United States annexes it. When that happens, there's a dispute between the United States and Mexico, which leads to the US-Mexican War. And then ultimately that leads to even more land acquisition because we gained the whole entire Mexican cession. So here's that disputed territory that helped lead to the US-Mexican War here in this top map in the darker purple part. Ultimately, that US-Mexican War is going to add this whole dark green area right here to the United States. That's the Mexican cession, and that's going to further manifest destiny, but also further migration. One political party that's connected to manifest destiny and the push for westward migration will be the Republican Party. They push for the Homestead Act, Pacific Railway Act, the Morrill Land Grant Act. All three of these acts are going to help with internal migration and also expansion westward and settlement westward. Asian migration is also a large part of the migration into the United States. Largely, Asians are coming in the 19th century because of the gold rush or because of jobs that were given to them through contracts in building the Transcontinental Railroad. Nativism is certainly going to be expressed against Chinese immigrants as well. So in this image down here, you can see Chinese immigrants as well as Caucasian immigrants in the gold rush. And you see over here two either ads basically saying that they did not support the Chinese being in the United States. And here's a political cartoon from the time period saying the Chinese must go. And you have part of an Uncle Sam chasing an Asian immigrant back specifically to China. So nativism is strongly going to be expressed against Asian immigrants. Again, nativism is this notion that Americans should only be white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and that we are not going to allow for people who are somehow different from that in the United States. The government is going to support that through the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And that's where I'm leaving off for this, and I will talk to you guys soon. Hope this helped. Bye-bye.